I want to start by acknowledging what a extraordinary time we're living through. Um, uh, Anti-Semitism, our subject for today, has been on the rise already for several years, but in the months since October 7th, it has just reached frightening proportions. And my response to this unprecedented set of circumstances is as a historian and as an educator, I've begun to teach the subjects that we'll be looking at today and in subsequent meetings. I've put together a course with the title Anti-Semitism, Zionism, and Anti-Zionism. It's a class in modern Jewish history. Today and our subsequent lectures will be a distillation of that. And my attempt is to show, first of all, how those three phenomena are interrelated. That'll become clearer as we move on today. And also, hopefully, to demonstrate, as I always try to, that through the study of history enables us to better understand and orient ourselves to the world today and the challenges we face. So my ulterior goal here. You'll let me know if it does the trick for you. Let's start with anti-Semitism. I'm sure you're all aware that there's been a tremendous amount of effort and energy leveled toward defining the term. Part of our current response to it has been a new discourse, not entirely new, but a renewed discourse around what that term means. And there are certain relatively minor issues that have come up, whether to spell it with a hyphen, anti-hyphen Semitism, or as one word. I'm on the side of one word for reasons that we won't go into today, but that is an actual debate, not in the academy and elsewhere. Also, whether since the term Semite and Semitism is part of the phrase, which, as I'm sure you're all aware, was only coined in the late 19th century by a German anti-Semite who was looking for a word to describe this new movement, this new ideology. And he came up with anti-Semitism. But sometimes I'm sure, again, you've all heard people suggest that, well, it's Semite, the word Semite, so it's not just about Jews. It's an opposition or hatred of all Semitic peoples, Arabs included, and that's just absurd. It's just wrong. It was from the very beginning a phenomenon that was about and directed towards the Jewish people, and that's been true from the beginning to the day today. And we could go on talking about these various minor issues. I find the attempt to define it to be not a complete waste of time and energy, but I don't think it's the best use of our time and energy. I would simply define it in very simple terms as the irrational ideology of Jew hatred. As simple as that. And one then can add illustrations and examples, but to define it to start should be relatively simple. It's irrational in the sense that it's false. It's a fantasy. It's crazy. Is kind of a given. I would add parenthetically that if you have a rational reason for hating Jews, there are some Jews I hate. Doesn't make me an anti-Semite because I have a rational basis for it, right? But the moment you begin spouting all kinds of nonsensical ideas about the Jews as a collectivity, it's irrational, it's crazy from the get-go. So the irrational aspect of it is essential, but should be fairly obvious. Jew hatred. It's a form of hatred. It's emotion. It's a psychological state, is also certainly part of the dynamic, the complex of anti-Semitism. But once again, I don't see it as central and key to the greater phenomenon. Instead, I emphasize the word ideology. It's an irrational ideology of Jew hatred. An ideology is a set of ideas, a system of beliefs and images and ideas about Jews. And that's where we get to what sets anti-Semitism apart, what makes it an object of historical study. And really, that's what I'd like to do with you today, is to spend a little bit of time reviewing, surveying al regel echad, on one foot in very short order, the history of anti-Semitism in order to demonstrate as best we can the more important question, not what it is, but where does it come from? How to account for the rise and development and perpetuation of this phenomenon. And I have to beg your forgiveness for a moment. Someone is buzzing me, so if you'll just take a breath, I'll be right back. Hello?
I'll take the moment to say that I put the information about CSP into the chat.
My
And
apologies. Is everyone okay?
I was just taking a promo moment to tell people to please support CSP, but go ahead.
Okay, great. So let's attack that deeper issue, that broader question of where does anti-Semitism come from? I think it's a key question here. It's one that we don't spend enough time on, and that's where my focus is. There is a world of theory around this question, as you may imagine, as should not surprise you. It begins in the aftermath of the Holocaust, the study of the phenomenon of anti-Semitism. But it has accelerated in the last several years, and I've read a lot of it. I have certainly not read most of it. It's a very broad literature and oftentimes quite fascinating. But I would boil it down to, as best I can, to four basic general theories. The first one, and I'm ordering these from worst to best. The first one being one that I would actually urge you to dismiss, but it's important to acknowledge, and that is the perspective of our tradition of Judaism. The Jewish traditional memory or understanding of anti-Semitism is one that the German Jewish philosopher Hannah Arendt called the myth of an eternal anti-Semitism. According to our tradition, anti-Semitism begins where everything begins, the Torah. And in the Torah, you know that there was an incident during the desert journey of the Israelites where they were attacked mercilessly from the rear by an evil enemy called the Amalekites, or in Hebrew, Amalek. And Amalek, ever since, in the Jewish reading of our Torah, has understood that as the archetype of the eternal anti-Semite. So that when Haman in the Scroll of Esther in the Purim story is introduced in the also a biblical book, he is described as a descendant of the king of the Amalekites. Haman was Amalek. During the Inquisition, Torquemada was seen by the Jews at the time as the revival, the reiteration, the return of Amalek. And that's been a more or less constant way that we Jews have understood this awful historical phenomenon throughout our history. It does continue to rear its ugly head. There is a famous line in the Pesach Seder: in every generation they rise up against us, and that is a good example too of this notion of an eternal anti-Semite. When Hitler emerges in the early 20th century, we Jews say, "Aha, Amalek, we've seen that before." When Hamas committed its heinous attack on October 7th, the Prime Minister of Israel and other Jews said, "Aha, Amalek." Once again, in other words, this is deep in Jewish consciousness, the idea that anti-Semitism has always been here, will always be here, is always essentially the same, and in a certain sense transcends history. Anti-Semitism is one, is eternal, is a kind of an independent force over and above the vagaries of history. Now, as a historian, I reject that out of hand, but at the same time, I understand how powerful is that in Jewish consciousness. It's not something we could simply, throw out in the morning in the garbage. It's part of our culture. It's part of our consciousness. But as a historian, I would suggest to you it is not particularly helpful in understanding this very complex phenomenon. The last thing I'll say about that is that in the Talmud, the rabbis weigh in. Their famous, oft-quoted statement on this issue is simply 3 words: Esau hates Jacob. The non-Jews hate the Jews. Always have, always will, end of story. Again, not very analytic, not very sophisticated, with all due respect. I think, generally speaking, our tradition of Torah and Midrash and Talmud and Torah Talmud is extraordinarily complex and sophisticated, not when it comes to anti-Semitism. We could talk about why that is, why there was not a tradition of Jewish historical thinking about things like this. But that's for another time, another lecture. Let's move on. That's the first general theory of anti-Semitism that is mostly associated with our Jewish tradition. That's the one I want to dismiss. Number 2, another general overarching theory of anti-Semitism is something that is also somewhat popular. In fact, there was a popular book written by Prager and Telushkin a number of years ago entitled "Why the Jews?" And that book and their approach is a very good example of this second general theory, and that is that we Jews have such a wonderful, beautiful, ethical, uh, uh, true tradition, religion, that others have objected to it in one way or another. So, most obviously, we were the first monotheists in a polytheistic world. And the polytheists didn't like that we were essentially calling their religion false, and they turned against us. And that's the beginning of anti-Semitism. It's a response to Judaism. It's a response to our self-image and self-understanding as God's chosen people. It's a response to our ethical system, to our highlighting of the commandment to love thy neighbor as yourself. That's the essence, the basic foundation of Jewish ethics. And when we first introduced that in the ancient world, other people took offense. And that generates anti-Jewishness and so forth. Now, there's a logic to this, and I don't want to dismiss this out of hand. The problem is there is just no or little, if any, historical evidence for this. It's an argument from logic. It's an argument from our understanding of our own tradition, and then a projection of how others might see that. That's very different from finding actual evidence that supports such a notion. So I don't want to dismiss number 2 out of hand, but I do want to suggest that 3 and 4 will be more helpful, and it's 4 that we're going to focus on ultimately. Number 3, again, the third general area of theories of anti-Semitism is that which does the opposite of number 2. It downplays the role of Jews in Judaism. It's about the anti-Semitic mind that needs someone to blame. It's often called scapegoat theory. The idea that anti-Semitism emerged throughout history because various other peoples and rulers and systems needed some out, needed an excuse for their bad behavior or for their self-recrimination, and that gets projected onto Jews. So it has nothing to do with actual Jews. It could have been someone else. It just happened to be, the Jews happened to be there, and they, unfortunately, tragically, got the brunt of that process. Now, here we do have more evidence for this sort of thing, and many contemporary scholars of anti-Semitism will tend to emphasize the way anti-Semitism is instrumentalized. It's an instrument of totalitarianism, for example, in Hannah Arendt's reading, or various other forms of government or social structures. It has, once again, less to do with actual Jews, with the actual content of Jewish life and Jewish culture and Jewish religion. It's that the Jews are a convenient way to redirect blame and to say it's the Jews who are our misfortune, which was the rallying cry of 19th century anti-Semitism. It becomes a political motto. The Jews are the problem. The actual Jews don't factor in. It's just they become a kind of a placeholder. So number 3 it's a good theory. Again, I'm wildly over generalizing and oversimplifying perhaps, but you get the sense that much of the theoretical approaches to anti-Semitism would adopt that kind of view. Now, the 4th perspective is my own perspective, is the one that I'd like to promote here, and that is the notion of anti-Semitism as being not something that floats above history, but quite the opposite, emerges out of historical circumstance. This is an emphasis on the historical contingency of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism does not have any kind of independent existence, but it comes out of various other issues and other constructs and other movements, and it becomes something that both is about Jews and is a response to Jews, and also uses Jews as a kind of an excuse or a scapegoat or the like. And what do I mean by this? And in order to illustrate that a little bit more clearly, let's now, once again, as we're doing today, we're rushing through an awful lot of material quickly, but I hope this will work for all of you. Now let's apply this basic theory, right, that it comes out of history, to the history of anti-Semitism. And one point I will make to start is that unlike some of the earlier theories, this theory is that much more, or that this theoretical approach is very clear that there is no one thing called anti-Semitism, but rather there have been throughout history many, many forms and iterations of anti-Semitism. We might even want to talk about anti-Semitisms because of the great variety and diversity of anti-Jewish expressions throughout history. It is often the first perspective, the eternal anti-Semitism, often talks about anti-Semitism as the longest hatred. And that's partly true in that there has been some form of anti-Semitism that's been around for a very long time, but the phrase suggests that it is singular and unitary and continuous when it is anything but. And so that's what I want to use the history to try to flesh out. And once again, in very brief, quick form, let's start with the origins of anti-Semitism. Historians of anti-Semitism across the board will trace the origins of this phenomenon to the pre-Christian era. So it's not Christianity that starts it, but it emerges prior to the rise of Christianity in the world of Greek and Roman antiquity. That is the context. The Hellenistic Empire and then the Roman Empire. And the condition of most Jews, the actual historical condition of most Jews during that period, is what we today call, with one word, diaspora. There is, of course, a community still living in the homeland of ancient Israel, Judea. The Romans will rename it Palestine. There is a Jewish community that is still in its home. But most Jews around the world, and there are millions of Jews in the world in this era, most of them live in Alexandria, in Asia Minor, in Babylonia, in North Africa already. The diaspora has already begun to grow and develop. And that's the basic condition for the rise of anti-Semitism, because in those diaspora communities, mostly cities, right? Jews will begin to gravitate to cities very early on. So we're talking about major urban centers such as Alexandria and Babylon, where the Jewish community, given their distinctive religious culture and traditions, will tend to group together and form a self-imposed, what later will be called a kind of a ghetto. But this is chosen by us in order to preserve and maintain our way of life. So whereas most other minority groups in the ancient world under the influence of Hellenism will begin to blend in, and again, I'm over generalizing, simplifying, but it's to make the point. For the most part, most other groups will integrate and assimilate culturally. That's one of the imperatives of Hellenism, to create a cultural unity between Hellenistic culture and whatever is the foreign culture. But there needs to be a blend. The foreign peoples need to ultimately assimilate to the beauty and power of Greek culture, right? So that's the force of assimilation. And Jews, perhaps more than any other such group in that context, will buck the trend and refuse to fully assimilate and fully acculturate and fully integrate, and instead they stick together. Now, if I'm a non-Jew seeing this, seeing those Jews sticking together, I could perhaps choose to understand it in a rational way. Well, that's their culture. You know what? It might even be a beautiful thing, right? That's all rational. It has to do with Judaism. It has to do with their distinctive set of theological beliefs and ritual practices and the like. That's a rational explanation for seeing Jewish segregation, self-segregation. Unfortunately, what emerges is going to be an irrational explanation for this phenomenon. And that irrational explanation is, oh, the Jews must be haters of all the rest of us. Jews are misanthropes, haters of humankind. And that is the first anti-Semitic belief that emerges both amongst the masses and amongst the intellectual elite in the ancient world. There are Greek and more especially Roman authors, philosophers, intellectuals who will write at great length about how the Jews are perverse. There is something suspect at best, evil at worst, about those Jews. That's the origin of anti-Semitism. It originates in the diaspora as a bad response to Jewish life. It is a false interpretation based on an observation of the way Jews behave. Now, that, as I said earlier, anti-Semitism is going to develop in many different forms, in many different varieties, and yet there will be, to my mind, an underlying common theme, if you will, or pattern or dynamic that does characterize anti-Semitism throughout. And as I've just described, that is that there is some truth. There is some observable reality about Jews. Anti-Semitism is the lie built upon that truth. And in a nutshell, again, as a historian, I hate boiling things down to their essence. That goes against the grain for social scientists, for an academic. But nevertheless, I find that it's an extremely helpful way to think about anti-Semitism. For one thing, it sets anti-Semitism apart from all the various other forms of group animus that we may encounter in the modern world, most notably racism. Racism is the belief that people of color are inferior to white people and therefore deserve a subsidiary status. That's racism. You know what? That's a false belief. There's nothing true about that. Nothing. There's no underlying truth to racism. Whereas anti-Semitism will almost as a rule have some underlying rational basis, which means that the lie that emerges is going to be that much more insidious, that much more difficult for us to fight, because the anti-Semite can say, oh, but look at the underlying truth. I'll give you just one quick example. You've all heard the anti-Semitic trope, the Jews control Hollywood, right? That's pure unadulterated anti-Semitism. Nevertheless, there are a lot of Jews in Hollywood. Jews have played a significant role in the history of Hollywood. Jewish executives, producers, directors, etc., continue to play, a prominent role in the Hollywood film industry. Everything I just said is true. But then look how quickly and easily it devolves into something malevolent. The Jews, meaning all Jews, control Hollywood, which means they control the media, which suggests there's some evil cabal behind the scenes of Jews trying to take over the world, influence feeble-minded Gentiles, right? The anti-Semitism is so unfortunately close to the truth that it makes it that much more, again, insidious. So I hope you're beginning to see, first of all, the distinctiveness of anti-Semitism. It does deserve its own word because it is something singular, something that is not simply like all of those other forms. It's not just simply racism directed toward Jews. It's more complicated than that. Let's move on to the next form of anti-Semitism that will emerge, and that is the religious. If the first kind we might call a kind of social anti-Semitism because of the way the Jews build their social structure in diaspora. The second, it has a religious basis, and it has religious history underlying it, and that is the emergence of early Christianity, which, very sad to say, will contain a strain of a form of anti-Semitism. There's no question. And again, I'll remind you, I'll acknowledge that there are scholars that do not like applying the modern term anti-Semitism to such ancient forms of Jew hatred. And there is a distinction to be drawn, which I'll come to. The modern variety is, once again, something unto itself. But still, the similarities are enough that I believe that the term anti-Semitism can be applied. You just need to qualify it. So ancient anti-Semitism is not exactly the same as medieval, and then modern anti-Semitism, but there's obviously certain commonalities. So let's talk for a moment about the Christian variety. Let me just check the time. How are we doing? We're 1:30. So we have Ari, I'll go for another 15 minutes, right? Is that the plan?
Yep, and then we'll do some Q&A.
Okay. So I'll try to be quick. Christian anti-Semitism, as you all know, will level the accusation, or a set of accusations, beginning in the New Testament, right? It's right there in the Christian Bible. If this were a course, we would study those texts together. But in especially the Gospel of John, there is the very clear statement that the Jews, it is in the voice of Jesus saying, you Jews are the children of the devil. And how do I know? Because you don't believe in me, Jesus. If you're not believing me, Jesus, that makes you demons. That makes you evil. Again, in a nutshell, that's the basic message of the Christian Bible. And sad to say, billions of Christians ever since have read that in their Bible and absorbed that way of thinking. So Christian consciousness, Christian civilization contains within it, at some level, these very malevolent ideas about Jews. That initial statement, the Jews are of the devil, will morph into, it will be demonstrated by the fact that it was the Jews that killed our Lord Savior, right? The Jews killed Jesus. The Jews killed God. Jews are God killers. Not only are they no longer God's chosen people because they sinned, and we Christians are now the chosen people, right? That's called Christian supersessionism, the replacement of the Jews with Christians. That's bad enough. But the idea, as if to further justify that, the accusation leveled that it was the Jews that plotted to kill him. It was the first conspiracy theory. And they didn't just kill some religious leader they didn't like. They killed God. Jews are the killers of God, not just in that moment, but throughout eternity. It's also a myth of eternal, constantly recurring religious truth. That later in the Middle Ages will be further distorted in all kinds of wild accusations. The Jews would kidnap a Christian child before their Passover in order to drain the blood and make matzah with that. Again, how crazy is that? One might be forgiven for saying, well, how could any human believe such an absurdity? And yet there have been, once again, far too many people throughout history who have believed such nonsense. Now, how does this fit into the pattern that I suggested a moment ago? Very simply, there is an underlying truth, which was true in Jesus's time, was true during the formation of early Christianity, and is true to this day. What's that underlying truth? Is that most Jews reject Jesus. It was true when Jesus was alive. Most Jews never heard of him, right? There were millions of Jews in the Roman world, most of them living around the Mediterranean in various diaspora communities. Never heard of him, right? He was some obscure religious nut back in Judea who, there was no internet, right? There was no way of publicizing that. So most Jews never heard of him. And those Jews who did, some chose to follow him. These become members of that original Jesus sect, as historians call it. But most Jews rejected him. And that will continue. Most Jews say, we already have a lovely relationship with our God. We already have a lovely religious tradition. Thank you very much. God bless you. If you want to, go create a new religion, God bless you, but leave us alone. Now, unfortunately, Christians and Christianity were not able to leave Jews alone because in the 4th century, they will come into power. The Roman Empire adopts Christianity as its official religion. And from that point on, Jews are going to be subject to various forms of Christian persecution based upon this anti-Jewish tradition. The most extreme form of adversos Judaeos, anti-Judaism, will not win the day, however, because it is also in the 4th century that the great early Christian church father Augustine, now Saint Augustine, will develop a theory about the Jews that says, yes, they're evil. Yes, they're sons of the devil. Yes, we should see them, in the light of the gospel, but we shouldn't kill them, nor should we kick them out. We should keep them here. We should preserve them in our culture and society as a witness to the truth of the gospel. That Jews in their degraded capacity will offer proof, will be a kind of pedagogic tool that we'll use to teach our Christian flock the truth of Jesus Christ and the Gospels. That comes to be known as Augustine's, the witness theory of St. Augustine. And it means that Jews are going to be, for centuries, 16, 17, 18 centuries, Jews are going to be the only non-Christian minority group that will continue to live in any appreciable numbers in Christian Europe. There are no other non-Christian groups, with the possible exception of the Roma, the Gypsy people. There are always exceptions to any rule, but the Jews are the primary other. the religious other, the social other, the political other in European history for centuries. All of it irrational, all of it malevolent, but Jews will continue to reject Jesus. Now, from a rational point of view, that's our right. We believe in diversity and pluralism, to each their own. But unfortunately, rather than having a rational response to this, the history of Christianity will again and again have an irrational anti-Semitic response. So in case after case, we have a truth that will unfortunately give rise to an irrational set of lies and false ideas about Jews. And it's that we call anti-Semitism. I could apply the same to the medieval form of an economic anti-Semitism, the idea that Jews are greedy, money hungry, money lenders. That's the anti-Semitic thing. There is, again, a truth underlying that we don't really have time for. Let me move into the modern period very quickly. Modern anti-Semitism deserves an entire lecture unto itself, but modern anti-Semitism for the first time is not going to be a part of some larger culture, but it will be a standalone, independent ideology. There will be, in the late 19th century, actual political parties whose ideology is anti-Semitism. We're the anti-Semite party. It becomes a feature of modern European politics in an explicit way, in a way that has no shame or self-doubt, but it becomes a belief system and a motivating ideology for many people in Europe. It will have a right-wing and a left-wing variety from the very beginning. And again, that's a longer lecture. It will adopt racial theory. And so modern anti-Semitism is the dovetailing of racism, which is a modern European phenomenon, with anti-Semitism. And the two come together in late 19th century racial anti-Semitism. And finally, in the 19th century, anti-Semitism also becomes a cultural code, as the historian Shulamit Volkov called it, a code for a set of various orientations in opposition to modernity. Anti-Semitism becomes code for anti-modernity. And all those people that are disenfranchised or otherwise left behind by the various processes of modernization will see that the Jews are doing fairly well in modern culture and modern society, and they will associate the two and begin to level their resentment toward modernization at the Jews. And so that too becomes a very potent form of modern anti-Semitism. Let me just end with, again, I apologize for running through an awful lot of material. I hope that we'll get to address some of these issues in the question and answer. Let me just simply look ahead. Our next two lectures will take what we learned today and apply it to the birth and development of the Zionist movement in the 19th century, which in large measure, in a significant way, 19th century Zionism is the response to modern anti-Semitism. One gives rise to the other. So we want to look at that relationship. We'll do that next week. And then, as you're unfortunately, sadly, all too aware, Zionism and the consequent the establishment of the state of Israel will give rise to an opposition to Zionism called anti-Zionism, which, as we have all become painfully aware, all too often turns into a form of anti-Semitism itself. So we come full circle. Started with anti-Semitism. Next week, we'll move to Zionism, then to anti-Zionism, which is too often a form of anti-Semitism, and we will complete that circle. So that's my introduction. I hope I haven't confused anyone too much, but happy to take questions. Ari, all yours.
Thank you. It's a lot of information to digest. I look at people's faces. It's like, like the hair blown back. It's always nice
being on a roller coaster.
It's always nice to have like an early morning California lecture of why people hate us. So thank you for giving us so many reasons.
Well, can I just say that this has not been the focus of my academic career, but I'm always in awe of my colleagues who teach this and teach the Holocaust year in, year out. I mean, they really live with this material. People who work in Holocaust museums just really live with this. Those are the people we should be in some awe of. Anyway.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't know if I want to live in that world 24/7, to be honest with you. So I don't mind taking an hour out to think about the big issues, particularly given what we see on the news. So I mean, people, please put your questions in. I already have a few that I've culled from the last 40 minutes. First thing is, do you have a reading list based on the class that you're teaching that you can share with me that I can share with the group? That would be
More than
number one.
happy. Very easy to do.
Number two, the word anti-Semitism. Can you take it apart to see? I mean, there was a question: why did that become the word? Like, why Semitism
Yeah.
is really
So
just
a
Jews?
couple. That's a great question. Should I address it first, or
Yeah,
you want to read
yeah.
the other one?
No, go ahead.
Okay. A couple of reasons. One is it was intended to give this movement, which kind of, at its heart, it was this ugly form of hatred, right? There's this vitriol, this malicious, malevolent thing. It was trying to give that the imprimatur of respectability. It's trying to assert that it was in fact rational, that it was in fact pseudoscientific in a way, and therefore it turned to the pseudo-scientific trend at the time of racialism, the idea that humanity was divided into races, into biological groups called races, and that each race was characterized by a certain level of intelligence, a certain personality traits. That has since been completely debunked. The field of anthropology arose in large measure in response to that nonsense. But in the late 19th century, coming out of Darwin and social Darwinism, there had developed this notion of racialism, again, a pseudoscientific belief system in racialism. So it was drawing on that. The racial classifications had divided the races largely according to language, families of language, and there was a Semitic language family from which that term is drawn, borrowed, adopted to apply to this new movement of Jew hatred. But as you know, let me reiterate, as I said earlier, it never had anything to do with anyone other than Jews. It was very clear. And this also goes to my point about Jews being the only non-Christian outsider group in Europe. I mean, so there were no Muslims, there were no Arabs, there were no people of color to speak of in Europe during that period. I mean, obviously there were some, but nothing appreciable. So the Jews are the clear target, and it's a kind of a euphemism. And because it's a euphemism, there are many today who would argue that we need to get rid of that term. It's not accurate. It is false. It's in fact what the anti-Semites called themselves. Why are we giving into them, right? So, I mean, I think there is an argument there, but the counter argument is that it's a little too late. The term has become universally adopted, and it is now universally understood that anti-Semitism is that complex of relatively unique phenomena that add up to this greater phenomenon of hating and opposing Jews. And also, one thing I didn't point out earlier is that we often use the term to describe the consequences of anti-Semitism: discrimination, persecution, expulsions, ghettoization, and mass murder, genocide. Those are all the outcomes of anti-Semitism, and too often people will sort of conflate the two and call that the history of anti-Semitism. Obviously, there's a relationship, but I would say lahavdil. Let's just be careful about distinguishing there.
Thank you. Going back to your biblical roots, isn't the story of Egypt the original story of social anti-Semitism or anti-Jew?
Yeah, well, I mean,
because I mean the story itself says there's a people amongst us. I mean the Jews went down, and then the story itself talks about Jews as living separately, differently, and therefore it ties into your social anti-Semitism.
yeah. So whoever asked that, that's a nice point. I thank you for that. I would push back a little bit that it's too easy to see any enemy of the ancient Israelites through our lens of anti-Semitism. The ancient Pharaoh, obviously a villain of the biblical narrative. There's no question about him being a bad guy. But there are also other enemies of the Jews, the Philistines and others, who can also be read through a different lens of simply these are our geopolitical enemies, and enemies tend not to like one another and tend to mistreat one another. And the enslavement of the ancient Israelites, which, by the way, is not it's not something we talk about in historical terms, but obviously it's our it's our narrative, it's our Torah. But taking it literally, the enslavement of the ancient Israelites served a practical need. He didn't do it as a form of cruelty specific to those ancient Jews. I'll get those Jews. I can't stand Jews. Let's put them in slavery and force them to build pyramids. He needed slave labor, right? So there was a practical, pragmatic one might say, rational basis for the Pharaoh's evil. So it's not quite the same as the way in which anti-Semitism will later develop, primarily based upon these crazy beliefs about Jews. That doesn't really appear in the biblical story. Having said that, I think I think you're right that it does conform to certainly my description of Jewish life in the diaspora. There was, one can easily imagine, and maybe it's a little midrashic, but one can easily project into the minds of the ancient Egyptians a kind of resentment toward the Jews for being a people apart. And yes, that begins to become something akin to anti-Semitism. I think it's more important, though, to stick with the historical perspective and really see the way in which it comes into full view in later on in the diaspora. There we have, a good amount of material of historical external evidence for the rise of anti-Jewish ideas. The fact that it's in the Torah to some degree is problematic because the Torah was written by Jews for Jews. It was in a kind of an internal document. So it doesn't really provide us with the same kind of solid historical evidence that archaeology does, for example. So again, thank you for the comment. I certainly wouldn't reject it entirely, but I do want to repeat my emphasis on it having emerged from historical circumstances of Jews living in diasporic conditions.
Thank you. And I know we'll get to this issue, but since you've set out the framework, we live in a world now where we're in the middle between right-wing anti-Semitism and left-wing anti-Semitism. And right-wing, I think we can see based on the theories you just suggested, economic issues, people on the right wing tend to see Jews as replacing them in jobs, economic issues. There's social issues. Jews are different. The right wing tends to be more religious. So one of the things I think we're going to get to is then, the basis of left-wing anti-Semitism. I don't know if you want to touch that now or if you want to, and how it fits into what you just...
I skipped over it because of time. It's very important. I would, first of all, again, want to lie on top of a truth issue. So what is the underlying historical circumstance? And that emerges at the dawn of Jewish modernity, which was the European first Enlightenment and then political emancipation. And the first emancipation of the Jews was following the French Revolution. And it was in the French National Assembly in 1789, immediately following the revolution, which successfully got rid of the monarchy. And in that moment of inventing the new modern liberal nation state that France would become, the members of the French National Assembly began to debate a question that first emerged then, but then would resonate throughout the next century or more, and that becomes known as the Jewish question. What to do with the Jews? Okay, we're going to give everyone equal citizenship. And then someone else says, you mean even the Jews? That's the Jewish question. There will be various solutions offered to that problem or that question by Jews and others throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. Of course, Hitler's final solution is a reference to that problem, right? But earlier on, there were various solutions offered, some of which will become modern anti-Semitism. So very quickly in that French National Assembly, the more liberals sat on the left side of the room, the more conservative members sat on the right side. That's where we get right versus left, first of all. And each one of them, in standing up to opine on the Jewish issue, basically give us the basis for what becomes left-wing versus right-wing anti-Semitism. The right-winger stands up and says, I know, I'm a bishop of Nancy. I know the Jews, but by virtue of my job, I come into contact with them. I know them well, and I'm here to tell you that they can never become Frenchmen because they are a foreign tribe. How can we admit people who are strangers, who constantly look to another nation as members of our nation? Right. So the essence of right-wing anti-Semitism is seeing the Jews as foreign, as other, as unassimilable. They can never truly be loyal, patriotic Frenchmen because they're Jews. That's the basis of right-wing anti-Semitism, which will grow and develop for the next century or more, ultimately informing Nazism and enabling the Holocaust. Left-wing anti-Semitism also has a lengthy history, which also is born in that same moment. The champion of the liberals and the promoter of emancipation of the Jews will stand up in that assembly. His name was the Count Clermont de Tonnerre, and de Tonnerre will say, yes, of course we should grant the Jews citizenship. Of course we should invite them into our new nation on one condition. In other words, it's a quid pro quo. And he says in no uncertain terms, they must give up being a separate nation. That part of Jewish self-understanding that sees themselves as a nation, that has to be jettisoned. And they, from here on in, they are only to be defined as a religious group. And if they do that, then they can join the party and become Frenchmen. We can emancipate them. The debate will continue. They will finally emancipate them. It will take, for the Sephardim, who are already acculturated Frenchmen, it takes several months. For the Ashkenazim, who are more traditional and dress in a different way of northeastern France, it will take over a year. But ultimately, the Jews of France will be emancipated. Emancipation will then become a major political football throughout the political debates of the 19th century. But always you have these two parallel developments of the right wing, who says Jews will always be outsiders. They are, and it's even in their blood. That will bring in the racial piece of it, right? Versus the left-wing anti-Semitism that says, oh, we love Jews, let's have them join us. They've got to stop being Jews, right? In other words, it's a universalistic attack on Jewish particularism. And so that's what underlies. And what is the ultimate form of Jewish particularism, if not Zionism? So just imagine how exasperated and perturbed a left-winger socialist communist revolutionary is going to be by the emergence of Jewish nationalism. It's going to completely discombobulate them, as it does to this day, as we see on college campuses around this country.
Wow.
And maybe,
Okay.
And maybe that's a good place to end today, unless we have some.
Well, I think there's two subtopics people are asking about. One is Muslim anti-Semitism and how we understand that. And the second one is Jewish anti-Semitism. In other words, self-hating Judaism. Yeah. So I don't know if you want to get to either of those, or if you want to.
They're both good questions. They're both important subjects. Let me speak firstly to why I left out Muslim anti-Semitism, and that is because by and large, anti-Semitism, in the sense we're describing, doesn't fully emerge in the Muslim world until the modern age. That's not to say there was not anti-Jewish discrimination in the Muslim world for centuries. There certainly was. Jews occupied a secondary status in Muslim society called dhimmi, the other, the stranger. So, and there were some form of a ghetto. There were periodic pogroms. I mean, there is anti-Semitism in Muslim history. It doesn't emerge as a full-blown ideology, absorbing and reiterating all of these various tropes. You know, the Jews are bloodthirsty baby killers and all that kind of narishkeit. That doesn't emerge in the Muslim world until much later, and it's largely the influence of the West. In other words, the Muslim anti-Semitism is absorbed from and learned from the anti-Semitism of Western Christian civilization. It will then combine with anti-Zionism. So it becomes particularly potent in the 20th century, and in particular later, especially following the Six-Day War. It's in the 60s, 70s, 80s when it becomes really virulent and really, it becomes that much more perturbing. We'll talk about that when we get to anti-Zionism, so I'll come back to that. The one thing I would just say is that one reason for the relatively lesser intensity of anti-Semitism in Muslim history is that the relationship of Islam to Judaism is different from Christianity to Judaism. I mentioned the word supersessionist with Christianity. Christianity sees itself as replacing Jews and Judaism. When a Christian reads the Torah and they read about Jacob, whose name is changed to Israel, they're reading about themselves. That's not about Jews, that's about us Christians, right? Christians have replaced Jews, theologically speaking. Whereas when a Muslim reads the Torah and they honor it as a prophetic work, as the word of God, right? In other words, the Muslims don't throw it out the window, they honor it. The Muslim will read it and they don't see themselves in Jacob and Israel. They see themselves in Ishmael, the brother of Isaac. So Jews are Isaac and Arabs and Muslims are Ishmael. And therefore there is a basis for coexistence and peace, right? So you do have throughout the history of Islam a greater potential for peaceful coexistence, and the history of anti-Semitism never becomes quite as virulent. And so, once again, in a nutshell, that is, I think, is an important distinction. In terms of Jewish self-hatred, the Jewish absorption of anti-Semitism, I would absolutely affirm that if anti-Semitism is part of our culture, it is baked into our society, it is systemic, it's part of the various ideologies and institutions that make up our civilization. The word systemic is key here. Anti-Semitism is part of Western civilization. Therefore, if I live in Western civilization, I may be subject to absorbing and adopting those ideas myself. And there are many, many Jews throughout in the modern world who unknowingly, unthinkingly have absorbed various aspects of that baked-in systemic anti-Semitism. Now, the one that we're most concerned with at the moment is the anti-Zionist story to be told that we'll be focusing in our last session. But I would suggest to you it goes much broader than that. I just saw on television last night, Jon Stewart did a thing. Whether you like Jon Stewart or not, I think he's a good example of how Jews can be unknowingly, unwittingly anti-Semitic. He did a thing. He did a joke about the new president of Mexico, and he said that, oh, if you're going to listen to NPR, they're going to want to pronounce her name perfectly. They're going to say Claudia Sheinbaum. Fuck you, Jon Stewart. It was absolutely a Jew being anti-Semitic. Excuse me for my language. I apologize. The availability of anti-Semitic attitudes, thoughts, images, statements is just too pervasive. It's too easy for us to adopt them and absorb them. And I want to suggest we're all subject to it. It's not just the kids on college campuses. We're all part of an anti-Semitic world. We don't see much of the anti-Semitism. That's another aspect of it being systemic, and that it's kind of invisible. And so we often absorb it in one way or another ourselves. And it's once again the importance of a good Jewish education, and especially Jewish history, that helps. That is not the only answer. It's not the only antidote, but it is, I believe, one effective way of undoing and resolving. And once again, to introduce our next subject, that is exactly the reason that Zionism will emerge. It's to undo these various negative effects of anti-Semitism on the diaspora Jew. The essential part of Zionism was to remake Jewish consciousness. We are not a bunch of sniveling, weak cowards that the anti-Semites see us to be, but we are in fact strong, independent, autonomous, powerful people as Jews. That's Zionism. And again, with that, I think that's a good segue, no?
That's a good segue. So at least you ended on a high point.
The most part, Zionism is a high point.
Hopefully we didn't depress all of you too much, but I think we educated everybody. I think it was a great 1 hour deep dive into.
And can I shout out to Ed Medros? Hi, Ed.
Yes, you can.
Okay.
Of course. Does everybody know Ed?
My Chelsea homeboy. I have family from Chelsea also.
Oh, you do?
I do.
Yay. Walnut Street Synagogue.
As does Charlie Savinor, right?
Yeah. His dad. Right. His dad and his grandfather.
Yeah.
Okay, everybody. That's it for Tuesday. Hopefully, lots to think about, and getting lots of nice comments here about the program, David, and how clearly you articulated this very complex issue. But I think you put it into some really interesting categories, and I look forward to getting the reading list that I can share with everybody.
I will send it to you forthwith.
For now, happy Tuesday, everybody. Be safe
everyone,
out there.
see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye. Excellent.